In 2005, Colleen Heffernan published a historical fiction book called A Kind of Courage, an extravagant read that focuses on themes of courage, forgiveness, and persistency. The story begins on the Tamblins farm in 1918 during World War I, and we're introduced to Hattie Tamblin, a 16-year-old girl whose older brother Will enlisted in the military back in 1916. Due to his absence, Hattie's mother falls in Great Depression, her father struggles to find help on the farm, and her 13-year-old brother Johnny began hanging out with the Hamilton bunch, in other words, the bullies. Heat strikes once again when David Ross, an 18-year-old conscientious objector, is hired to help out on the Tamblins farm. Since conchies are considered cowards, Hattie and Johnny disapprove of David at first, as it would lead to embarrassment for their family. Throughout the story, we learn more about David and his reasons for not enlisting, which will further be discussed. Together, Hattie and David discover different forms of courage and that it comes from where we least expect it. The two main characters also experience a chaste romance, which brings more excitement to the story. Heffernan switches perspectives between the two main characters, Hattie and David, which allows the reader to get a full picture of the other character, as well as their worldview. Most of the book takes place on the Tamblins farm in Ontario in 1918. Although with David's flashbacks and switching perspectives, the timeline ranges from 1910 to 1919. Hattie's farm is described to be quite spacious, with a barn just outside their house. The barn is where David stayed when he was helping the Tamblins out, and it's quite big with a tall roof and a hayrick. There's a fence that surrounds the field, and further down lies the woods, where we find the Nottingham Rock, where Hattie spent most of her childhood playing with her older brother, Will, and his friends. Past the woods lives Mrs. Nelson, Hattie's neighbor with whom she had a close friendship with. Further down the path from Hattie's house lives a boy named Eli, who helped Hattie's father on the farm and often visits them because he believes Hattie's father still owes him for the work he's done. Hattie's not a big fan of Eli. In fact, she sees right through his fake charm. In David's perspective, it switches a lot between his house in Toronto, his church, and many other locations that would fit the event going on in the story. At the beginning of A Kind of Courage, we are introduced to the main character, Hattie Tamblin, a 16-year-old girl who lives on a farm in Ontario with her younger brother Johnny and her parents. We find out that Will, Hattie's older brother, has enlisted in the military in 1916, and for these past 2 years, her parents suffered from depression and finding help on the farm, and her younger brother Johnny became a bully and a troublemaker. The rising action of the story strikes when Hattie's father hires David Ross, a conchie, someone who refuses to enlist in the military, to help out on their farm. Hattie and Johnny disapprove and hate the embarrassment they bear because of David Ross. The perspective then switches to David's, and we find out more of his past and his doubt in enlisting in the military because it's against his conscience to kill. Between the rising action and the climax of the story, the perspective between Hattie and David switches multiple times, as well as flashbacks to David's past. In one of David's flashbacks that took place in 1911, he met Franz Liedermann, a brilliant German musician who taught and encouraged David to pursue his passion for piano. This event is immensely vital to the story because it shows the courage in David to continue doing something he loves, despite his father forbidding him to play, because according to him, it's not something that boys do. The climax of the story takes place when David saves Johnny, Hattie's younger brother, from bullies and resulted him in getting beat up. This relates to the themes of courage and forgiveness because he stood up for someone that hated him. The falling action occurs when David visited his cousin Julian and brought him candy, the ones he used to bring to his little sister Katie. This relates to the theme of forgiveness because Julian used to treat David poorly and always called him a coward throughout their childhood. Regardless of the way Julian treated him, David forgave him and visited him and even played the piano for him after he was injured at war. The story ends with David and Hattie writing letters to each other, and in one of David's letters, he wrote, "Courage is not something we have, it's something we share." This satisfied the ending of the book and wrapped things up between David and Hattie on good terms. It also reflects the book because they both went through stages of finding courage, and in the end they both shared their courage and taught each other many things about themselves. The two main characters are David Ross and Hattie Tamblin. We have already established that David was hated by Hattie at first because it was embarrassing to have a conchie work for them, but although he didn't enlist, he still showed his courage in many other forms. The most significant moment was where he protected Johnny from the bullies and Hattie brought it up to Mrs. Nelson. He knew they might have killed him, so he couldn't be a coward, could he? Hattie wondered why he didn't enlist, and that he couldn't be a coward because he had an immense amount of courage to stand up for Johnny like that, knowing he could be killed and that Johnny doesn't even like him. David's authenticity was portrayed through the fact that his father didn't let him play the piano, but he still stayed true to himself and continued practicing with Mr. Lederman. Even when he worked on the farm, he still practiced on a cloth piano that Mrs. Lederman gifted him. David had also mentioned that it's against my conscience to kill, meaning he didn't enlist into the military not because he was a coward, but because he stayed true to his beliefs. Lastly, on Hattie's farm, David proved many times how hardworking he is. Even Hattie brought up the fact that he did chores without Hattie's father asking him to. He even did things Will wouldn't do. David fit the theme of courage and forgiveness in the book by saving Johnny and forgiving his cousin Julian for always looking down on him. He also fit with the theme of persistency because Mr. Lederman was the only one to push him to keep playing, and without him he probably wouldn't have mustered up the courage to continue his hobby. The second main character is Hattie Tamblyn, a 16-year-old girl who lives with her parents and two brothers on a farm in Ontario. The first trait Hattie reveals is her boldness. She was never hesitant, always bold, much too bold for Mima's liking. When David first arrived, her shock resulted her in hesitating to speak in her usual daring manner, although she eventually warmed up to him and spoke the way she always did, which was one of the reasons David began liking her. When David was laying in the barn after getting his leg broken by the Hamilton bullies, Hattie seemed to worry about him and his injuries. By showing her raw emotions and caring for him, she fits the theme of forgiveness because, in a way, she forgave and accepted the fact that David's a Conchi and treated him like a human. She also treated her mother with care by taking over all of the house chores because her mother was falling into Great Depression. Lastly, the most obvious personality trait Hattie displays is her vulnerability. She is real and honest with her feelings for most of the story, and that's another reason why David began to slowly fall for her. In a scene where Hattie catches David in the woods, practicing piano on his cloth one, she bursts out. Hattie's voice climbed. "And you out here, crazy as a loon, playing with a piece of cloth." She displayed her concern for Will, the fact that his life is on the line while David out here is safe and sound, doing useless things. Characters that can be honest with themselves bring life to the book, and she fits the theme of courage because she's brave enough to show her raw emotions. Overall, Heffernan's writing style was very descriptive and included quite a bit of dialogue. Without dialogue, it's challenging to identify the way a character speaks. Even if the character is well described, adding dialogue helps obtain the exact perspective on the way the character talks, with what emotion and attitude. Heffernan did an outstanding job of sort of building up towards an event that's coming up, which adds tension and results the reader in being curious of what is going to happen. Another thing Heffernan does is use fragmented sentences, which also created intensity and helped with the build-up in an interesting scene. Throughout the story, the perspective changes between David and Hattie, although Heffernan still wrote in third person. By doing that, not only does it help the reader know what the character's thoughts are, but also gives a brief overview of what the other character's thoughts are and their tone. This also gives the reader an omniscient point of view. For example, she would write, "He reached out towards her. His voice had a hint of desperation." And this would be written in Hattie's perspective while describing David's emotions, his actions, or the way he talks. Heffernan did an incredible job making these characters come to life and make the story intriguing. Personally, I have a lot to say about this book as I've made some strong connections with the characters and adored the relationship between David and Hattie. Since I come from a strongly religious family and this book has a religious aspect, I could connect with the story directly. Although I would say I connected with David the most because of his passion for piano, and I've been playing for 7 years, so I definitely understood his frustration when his father wouldn't let him play. In a way, David's character actually motivates me to keep playing and to be thankful for even having a piano in the first place. I extremely enjoy romance books. It's probably my favorite genre, and I absolutely love the relationship David and Hattie built throughout the story. Even though she hated him at first, he still continued to be respectful, helping her and her family out when they were having a rough time, and being the person she could talk to about her problems. In my opinion, it made the story heartwarming but also slightly upsetting when he left, and the only thing they could do was write to each other. Her overall character development brought me so much comfort and just adds to the book. I would definitely recommend this book for teenagers because the two main characters are teenagers, and it's really easy to click or connect with the characters. Also, anyone who's a fan of historical romance, this would be the perfect choice for you. Heffernan blew my mind with this book. Her writing style is practical, and she discussed vital themes through well-constructed characters with a touch of teen romance.